All right, let's get started. Hi, everybody. My name is Scott Brooks. I'm with OrgVitality, and welcome to the last webinar of the first day of our virtual conference for September. What the heck are your employees thinking and why you need to care? Just a couple of quick statements. You will get handouts, so don't worry about taking copious notes. You will get access to a recording, so if there's something particularly pithy that you missed, you'll be able to review it. So we're going to dive in, and I'd invite you to just sit back, enjoy, and let these messages sort of wash to you. There are four main points I'm going to be describing, plus some implications about what it all might mean, but let's dive in. So like I said, I'm Scott Brooks. I'm a partner and vice president of OrgVitality, and I will be your presenter today. And I do have one clarification about today that I definitely want to make before we dive in. In case you hadn't known or realized, it's not September 10th. What it really is it's March 194th. And so I know we're all in this sense of stasis and waiting, and we're collectively working through how to handle all kinds of 2020 activities and how to move forward. But what I want to talk about today is really focused on the pandemic challenge. And certainly, as we all know, there's all kinds of stress and frustration and some anxieties around us, not just from COVID, but you could pick it, civil unrest, some extreme weather events, wildfires in California, where I happen to be. But the goal of this session is not so much to focus on all of that, but to say, what does all of this mean for the workforce, and in particular leadership, and what are people thinking about leadership? Now, there are some things that we can look at. Global crises, unfortunately, are not new. There are some learnings we can pull from about how organizational leadership and how engagement and pride and so forth has been impacted by other kinds of crises, environmental, economic, war, other kinds of terrorist events we will draw from. Yet there are definitely some things about this crisis that are a little bit unique. It is a truly shared global experience. It's essentially simultaneous across the planet, and everybody knows what social distancing means. Everybody knows what wearing a mask is like. And it's also a human against nature storyline. Sometimes we want to be able to blame a bad guy, but there is a hard search for exactly who's the bad guy and who can we blame or hold accountable. It is true that we can't blame people for causing this, but we can hold leaders responsible for their response. And that's one of the things that we're going to get into, because certainly leaders' responses do set a tone to be remembered. So as I alluded to at the outset, I'm going to crank through four themes for you to hang on to when you think about leadership in organizations. And I'll flesh some of it out with some background and some evidence, but don't be too daunted by all of that. Mostly sit back and just let it flow. So here you go. Here's number one. At first, through a crisis, employees feel good about work, maybe even better than normal. Let me give you some evidence and some backdrop for what this is all about. And I'm going to particularly focus on post 9/11 highlights that point to gains in organizational pride and trust in organizational leadership. And the first little bit of evidence I'm going to cite comes from some research I did back in 2001, 2002. And there's more backdrop to this, but basically Gansweiler research at the time had polls and norms that would be annual, very stable. I'd be happy to send you more information about that if you like. But every single year it asked some questions. And most notably here, just focus on the red line, where suddenly between 2000 and 2001, there was a great big bump. And 9/11 was right before the 2001 dot. And that red line is leadership credibility. So that happens to be 6 points. And if we look at some of the top improvements in that zone across an entirety of surveys, you can see leadership credibility went up 6 points, commitment to quality up 6 points, and so forth. So first thing we can say is that leadership credibility went way up, and also company pride, for example, that's the last item on the list, went up 5 points in these national norms. And so that's notable. And that had some good rationale behind it, just like pride and trust in institutions went up in the United States as a whole. We saw that reflected in our own organizations. Now, moving away from the workplace for a minute, we can look at different leadership dynamics of world leaders. And if we were to look back at President Bush's approval rating in 9/11, right there, that very first uptick, just about an inch in from the left of the graph there, that's September 11th, where if you happen to remember, President Bush's approval rating shot up from somewhere around 50 to about 90. There's more going on in this chart, but let's just let that slide for right now. What this allows us to do is to compare how do other world leaders look today. And one of the things you can see in this chart, again, there's a lot going on, but let this just kind of wash over you, is everybody starts at 0, whether it's Australia, Canada, Germany, all the way down through Brazil at the bottom of the list. And then how do world leaders' approval change? How do they manifest as we go from the WHO declaration of the pandemic on March 11th all the way through and into April? And you can see here that there's a general sweep upwards, which is not exactly the same as President Bush's rating, but it's a general tone that trust in leadership is kind of gone up. So let me skip from this. You can let just all that float for a second. Let me go back inside organizations and see what they look like today. Now, there was a session earlier today in the conference, and you might have got a chance to see it. Jerry Seibert talked about a COVID pulse that OrgVitality offered. We've got more than 60,000 responses, but just some really fast blast scores from there. 93% thought senior leaders responded quickly. 92% thought the organization's response had been effective. 91% said senior leaders prioritize, employee and family health and safety, and 86% said that leader communication was transparent and open. Now, we don't have exactly trend scores on all of these, but if you've been in and around surveys for a while, you would know that anything with the term senior leaders or executive leadership in it that scores high is pretty spectacular. And any survey item that scores in the 90s is also pretty spectacular. So this is a double whammy that basically says, hey, people are giving senior leaders the benefit of the doubt. They're looking upwards. They're ready to be led. So if that's number one, that leadership credibility is plausibly up everywhere, or at least a lot of places, and maybe even organizational pride, we now ask the question, why? Why are these things going up? Why is this sort of surprising finding happening where in a crisis people actually feel a little bit better about some things around them? And we're going to be talking about some of these, and the first why, set of whys, is about bonding with each other, in and around with each other, comparisons people make, and then we'll get into humanized leaders and something actually called the rally around the flag effect. But starting with bonding, just some psychological fundamentals. It doesn't take long before you can find some great research that are about basic human tendencies, how the stress of disaster brings people together. And if you've been through a disaster, you feel that sometimes, that people are all focused on helping and so forth. And not everybody everywhere, but tends to be this way. And then in terms of comparisons, there's another basic human kind of a thing to focus on. Well, it could be worse. And there's a lot of research on that where, if you're seriously ill, you could say, well, at least I'm not as ill as somebody else, or it's not as bad as it could be. And with regard to today's relevance, you could say, hey, at least I'm employed, or at least I'm not sick, or at least I'm not dead. So there is this sense of, well, it could be worse, because what is worse is so prevalent and so available for us to be thinking about. Another sense of comparison, and back inside organizations, that research in that database I mentioned before, it was called Work Trends, and it was by Gansweiler Research, and that showed that that red line, that executive credibility went up 6 points. Turns out that in 2002, a year of corporate scandals, you may remember Enron and WorldCom and Sarbanes-Oxley came in as efforts to try to help keep people a little bit more on the up and up. It was a year of corporate scandals, and yet leadership credibility increased another 2 points. And the big question was, well, how can that be? And the answer from back in the day that does highlight this comparison kind of thing is, well, you know what? There are plenty of corporate scandals out there, but our people are better than that. And so that's really what was going on there. So again, comparisons and bonding. Moving off to Humanized Leaders, there is no longer a barrier in the same way that there often is between you and your leaders. Maybe they used to be up on the top floor of the building, and maybe they were isolated there and so forth, but now you get to peek inside their homes through Zoom and through video conferences and other kinds of things. You hear the dogs and the kids, and people are connecting and bonding to each other on a more human level, and that also humanizes leaders. So you say, all right, these are real people. And then the last why that I just want to touch upon briefly is something called the rally around the flag effect. So just like President Bush's boost that you saw, actually this dates back to 1970 when there was this paper you can see here published on presidential popularity from Truman to Johnson. And it talked about how certain crises, in particular external crises, where you interpreted the leader as having a genuine effort to try to address things, that tended to boost their approval ratings. So the same kind of dynamic applies in organizations. Now, I mentioned that scores tended to go up in leadership and pride and some whys about it, but I want to be quick enough to mention that polarization can happen. What does this mean? This means that scores won't always go up, but oftentimes scores might shift around. And you may remember or have heard actually one of my favorite quotes about the last recession, which Warren Buffett said, when the tide goes out, you can see who's been swimming naked. Another pundit said basically that a host is like a general. It takes a crisis to reveal their genius. So, you know, I'm sure Warren Buffett was paraphrasing Socrates or some other type of great here, Sun Tzu. But what this implies is that there can be a little bit of a credibility pivot. And again, back to that work trends research that I highlighted some of before, this time from 2003, you can see blue bar is people from organizations that were performing better, gray bar from people that were organizations performing worse. And there's a clear, distinct difference in perception of their leaders in both these organizations. So to employees, performance is highly linked in people's minds to effectiveness of leadership, as it should be, right? So what this says is that there can be pivot points. So let me skip back out of organizations into other kind of social research for a minute. And there is the World Happiness Report that looked at earthquakes and floods and storms and tsunamis and economic crises and so forth. And it looked less at employee opinions in the workplace and more just happiness in the world. But one of their basic findings is that in a high trust society, there is distinct cooperation to work together and rebuild. And often this is a surprising increases in happiness in the wake of disasters. And people are surprised at the willingness of neighbors and institutions to help each other. And there's a belongingness and pride. And sometimes all of that's enough to psychically compensate for all the material losses in people. Now, that's in a high trust society, but they also say that where the social fabric is not strong, you can have the fear and the disappointment and the anger that costs to happiness. And this is the same kind of a thing that happens in organizations. And so what we can do is we can see that higher survey scores are more likely generally, because generally they tend to go up and be high. However, there can be some pivot points to look for in your own organizations. Is the crisis external? And in the case of COVID, yeah, it is, at least initially. Now, some of the responses or some of the human interaction since then and everything like that, there's not entirely necessarily an external crisis, but at least initially this one. But also we want to know that the organization is fundamentally sound, just like the fabric of society is fundamentally strong. And is leadership fundamentally sound? And is there some existing basis of trust to work from? And also, there are signs that survey scores might get a little higher when there were pre-existing trends that were moving in the right direction. And so you are leaning into those trends and working with them rather than suddenly abutting something. There is a summary of this kind of thing that I love, which is research points to that when uncertainty is high, employees are more likely to turn to leaders. And those leaders' behaviors seems to have a stronger effect on employee outcomes and also organizational outcomes, right? So this is not just random crisis research. This is also a lot of leadership and management research and so forth. And so one of the things this suggests is that swings in scores, whether up or down, they don't come out of nowhere. They're built from a fundamentally sound place. So I'm coming now to my number 4 of my 4 big things. So first one was that, people feel surprisingly good. Second is that there were some whys like bonding and comparisons. This last one is that I just covered was polarization can happen. And now we have that the effects of this can last, but will depend on some responses. Okay, so here's another bit of research. Focus again on the red line at the bottom here. That's leadership credibility, how from 91 to just after 9/11 and the 2002 dot, it showed some upswing and pretty flat, then upswing. But then importantly, through 93, 94, 95, it kept going up a couple of points. And so that meant that nationally in the United States, there was no sudden deflation of this rally around the flag effect or this trust that we were giving to our leadership. There was something that endured. So will it endure in your own organization, or will it endure? Well, just like I mentioned before with the polarization, there are a few things to think about, some pivot points. Watch as the world, your organization translations from, you don't blame leaders that COVID exists, but you might blame leaders or hold them responsible for how they respond, either positively or negatively. And particularly as money runs out, as current systems get more strained, messages have been changing a little bit from, hey, keep safe, to get back to work. And get back to work and just suck it up. Don't tell anybody you have COVID. There's little stories about that and everything, so forth and so on. You can blame people for all of that, but that's something to keep an eye out for as the messages and the value statements that they reflect will change. We do expect that high scores generally in aggregate will endure, but there will be some of these sort of more extreme polarization points where most people will win, but some will definitely lose, and you can look for pockets of concern. One other way to think about whether or not this will endure depends a little bit on leadership style. I mentioned the rally around the flag effect, and there's been some research about this in not just US presidents, but world leaders in general. And the research suggests that you could divide leadership into lots of different kinds, but in this particular case, let's focus on 2 kinds. There are 2 styles of leadership that have different crisis approaches. One is dominance, where it's a little bit more assertive, coming out confident and strong, a little bit more controlling in the messaging. The second style is prestige, where you're a little bit more helpful, a little bit more humble, a little bit more on sharing of knowledge and maybe attending to science or the other kinds of things that might be around. Now, these are 2 styles that have different effects inside of crises. Dominance can be a little stronger out of the gates. So people may approve of dominant styles a little bit more from the get-go. but over time, prestige seems to win. And so seems to have the stronger, more lasting effect. Now, when you think about that in your own organizations, it's pretty clear that you cannot easily change your top leaders' styles. Or if you are a top leader, it's hard for you to change your own style. But what we can do is try to encourage an echo of the non-default style in everybody's approach. You know, sometimes if you can be too humble, you might need to be a little assertive, or sometimes you can be too assertive and maybe to be showing a little bit more empathy is what works. So, and it's easy to picture. Dominance kind of satisfies people's needs for focus, for clarity, maybe for a little bit of confidence or something to hang on to, but prestige also gives people a little bit more of the sense of empathy and maybe a little bit better to work through longer term complex issues. So as we're kind of pulling this together right now, in summary, we can expect that, you know, our leaders might have more credibility than ever. Now, this is a tool to be leveraged for good, all right? Obviously, credibility is a great thing. We didn't ask for it. They didn't ask for it. We might not have earned it. It might just be that people are granting a little extra credibility due to a rally around the flag effect and so forth. And there's a chance it's a loner. But all of those caveats and those asterisks and saying that maybe the leaders didn't quite earn it or deserve it, let's set that aside for a minute. Let's just say that they've got it. So one of the questions is, how do you make the most of it? You can think of this as a reflection of people looking towards leadership through challenging times and a little bit of a heightened readiness to be led. So that is a tool, that's a resource, that's a hotline that you can use to your advantage. Now, I know that a number of you participating are also responsible not just for leading organizations, but maybe organizing surveys and survey work and so forth. So implications for employee listening. You know, I think that employees may be down. There may be a lot of stress out there and so forth, but not every opinion is down or grumpy. Perceptions of leadership, we can have a fair amount of confidence that they are often up. And so, you know, how do you do this? Interpret your own survey results in light of this kind of a thing. It's also true that we're all in the same storm. This is a simultaneous global event impacting, you know, every human being on the planet in some form. But we're not all in the same boat. Different segmentations, different industries, different organizations, different leadership styles, they all are riding the waves a little differently. And so how do you keep in touch with different segments and different sort of subsets that are super important to keep in touch with? And then, as I'm saying, keeping in touch, the last is, you know, find ways to keep in touch and help leaders stay calibrated. This doesn't mean a survey every hour to say, how you feeling now, how about now? But how do you help leaders maintain sort of the listening and the dialogue and the staying in touch with what people are thinking about? So that's pretty much the summary of this session. And so again, I went through 4 basic points. Again, a lot of opinions, particularly executive credibility and leadership opinions and approvals are up. That there are some whys for that, bonding and comparisons and humanizing and rally around the flag. Polarization can happen. There are some pivot points to look for, and that I think this could last. This could have some enduring qualities, and so part of our efforts is how to maximize that. So given all of that, I want to close out just by saying that, you know, this is the last session of today, Eastern time zone. We're nearing 5 o'clock. And so I want to thank you for your participation. We do have a great lineup for tomorrow. And if any of this looks interesting, we've got folks from PepsiCo and GlaxoSmithKline and Jenny's Splendid Ice Cream and Medtronic and Qualcomm all coming to participate in the agenda tomorrow. But all of this is pretty spectacular, and it's not too late. You can register at OrgVitality.com for any of these that you like. I will say too that as you close out here, you will be presented with a survey with a couple of quick questions that about how the session went and any other thoughts you have, and it's really valuable for us to have you take a look at that if you like. So again, I know I blasted through quite a bit here, and I want to thank you for your time, and I will lurk here if there's any questions that come through the Q&A, but at this point I have not seen any come through yet. So thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of the day, and look forward to Friday.